Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Feeling that something strange was definitely afoot, Officer Scott Coonrod would go over to his squad car and would call his supervisor. He would also go to Chris Watts and would ask permission if the police could actually do further investigation in their home to find Shanann Watts and his two daughters, Bella and Celeste, which Chris Watts would have no problem with. The police would quickly go throughout the house and they would do further investigation, doing DNA searches, seeing if they could find traces of blood or anything within the house that would kind of prove foul play. And to their surprise, they would really find nothing. The house was completely clean. However, they would notice something very strange outside the home. Inside a garbage bin, they would actually find a bedding set that would be stuffed inside this garbage bin. And it would be exactly a sheet and pillowcases, but it would be everything in a bedding set except for a fitted sheet. And they could tell that by the size of this bedding set, it would have went into the master bedroom of the Watts home. It's at this point that the police would quickly call the FBI to have their assistance with finding out where Shanann Watts and Bella and Celeste was. This missing case would start creating a lot of buzz and media coverage, and Chris Watts would volunteer to do an interview about looking for his wife and his two children. Chris's mother, Cindy Watts, would actually strongly urge against it and would tell Chris, "We're not insinuating that you're guilty, but anyone that normally does these types of interviews typically look guilty, and it would push all of the police attention towards you." But Chris Watts would actually ignore this and would go forward with the interview, and what Cindy Watts would say would just be exactly what happened. As the interview went down, Chris would show no sign of emotion or no sign of concern about his wife or his two children. And he would seem very well rested and just well put together. Someone definitely not showing signs that their wife and their two children had went missing. And once again, the police would go to the neighbor, Nathaniel Trenastich, and he would have more very enlightening information. Nathaniel would tell the police that he did not know anything about Chris and Shanann Watts going through a divorce. But he would say he would not be surprised, as there were certain things that went on in the home that were very questionable. For starters, Nathaniel would insinuate that Chris was a lot more abusive than he would play out in front of the camera or around other people, and would say that there was a lot of screaming matches going on within the home. Nathaniel would go much further and say that, actually, to be precise, before Shanann Watts would go on a business trip, prior to that, she had actually gone over to her parents' residence and had stayed there for several weeks before coming home, leaving Chris Watts alone at the home, which was starting to paint a much different picture than Chris had started painting or Shanann had painted on social media. For example, on June 11, 2018, Shanann Watts would actually do a pregnancy reveal on social media. As part of her fan groups that was part of her following as an influencer were mostly mothers. So a lot of the stuff that she was posting on social media as an influencer was mostly stuff about her home, almost giving off that her and Chris had this perfect marriage. On this reveal, she would actually have a t-shirt on and say, "Oops, we did it again." Chris Watts would then walk through the door as if he was coming home from work, to where he would read the shirt, he would be grinning ear to ear, and he would walk off camera and you can hear him hug and kiss his wife Shanann Watts. And he would walk out in front of camera holding the pregnancy test, acting completely happy and over the moon that he and his wife were expecting a child. But unfortunately, just like most things on social media, this entire moment was completely scripted and acted out, as Chris Watts' original reaction when he first found out that his wife was pregnant was completely polar opposite than what people would see on social media. Where Shanann Watts was completely over the moon about the pregnancy of this new child, Chris Watts was completely polar opposite. And upon hearing about the news of her being pregnant, which was 3 days prior to when they made that little video, he would actually suggest to his wife Shanann that they get an abortion. where Shanann would actually post daily updates of her pregnancy on social media, as she would typically do as an influencer. Shanann would also post pictures like this on social media and would always say, "I really hope it's a boy this time so that Chris could finally get the son he always wanted." It was actually Shanann and his daughter's dream that they would actually have a little brother. And with Shanann leaving to go with her parents for several weeks, and shortly afterwards going on a business trip, spending less and less time with her husband, and the fact that Chris and Shanann Watts were constantly arguing and fighting, it gave police reason to believe that maybe Chris is a lot more guilty or knows more than he's letting on. So they would quickly start investigating his job. Police would find out that Chris Watts actually worked at a petroleum company called Anadarko. And what they would find out is that Mr. Chris Watts would have some secrets of his own. And they would forward emails showing that there was an inappropriate work relationship between Chris Watts and co-worker Nicole Kessinger. It's around this time that police wanted to at least give Chris Watts a polygraph test and kind of question Nicole Kessinger to see what she knew. And ironically enough, around this time, Nicole Kessinger would actually be giving the police a call. They would also give Chris Watts a polygraph test just to kind of see if he was being truthful with his answers. And a little side note about polygraph tests is you would need a +4 to at least pass, or a -4 to at least fail. +4 being that you are being about as honest that you could be, and -4 is detections that you are telling at least a lie. And Chris Watts would score a -18. So suffice to say, the police knew something was up. Nicole Kessinger would also walk into the police department to be interviewed, but her interview would be very questionable, as she would arrive there with her father, and he would sit down during this interview, which is very strange. Not really sure if he had pull with the police or not, but typically parents or guardians can't sit down with police interviews, especially if you're over the age of 18. And considering that Nicole Kessinger was not a minor, it's kind of weird that he would sit down through this investigation. And it's very apparent in these interviews that Nicole Kessinger's father was trying to put less and less attention on her as possible and trying to put as much of it on Chris. And even though there was not any solid evidence leading to Nicole Kessinger and the disappearance of Shanann Watts and her daughters, there was quite a lot of questionable things going on. For example, Nicole Kessinger would be asked if she knew that Chris Watts was married, and she would say that she had no idea that Chris Watts was married, and that if she had known about Chris Watts being married, that there wouldn't even be a relationship. And would go further and say that she had not known anything about Shanann until months and months into the relationship. But this would actually be a lie when they would investigate her phone and check her Google records. And around the time of January 2017, she had been looking on social media, not only Shanann Watts, but Chris Watts as well. This was a whole year before she had even met Chris at Anadarko. She would say other things as well that just did not add up or make sense, and would say that she gave Chris Watts all the availability to basically back away and work things out with his wife Shanann. But at the same time, she would also be on the computer Googling searches like wedding dresses and looking at wedding dresses for over 2 hours. She would say that the relationship was not serious, but she would also do Google searches like, can a man fall in love with his mistress? And they would uncover much, much more.